I grew up in North Carolina, not far from Boone, and I always thought I knew the mountain roads like the back of my hand. One October, about 5 years ago, I decided to take a weekend drive into Watauga County just to enjoy the leaves changing. My plan was simple: follow the Blue Ridge Parkway, pull off at some overlooks, and maybe hike a trail or two. It was around 3 in the afternoon when I noticed a narrow gravel road veering off from the highway. It wasn't marked with a sign, just a bent post and an old guardrail that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Curiosity got the better of me. I slowed down, pulled onto the gravel, and started following it. At first, it felt harmless, just another back road winding deeper into the trees. The light filtering through the canopy was gold and orange, and I rolled down the window to breathe in the crisp mountain air. But within 5 minutes, I noticed something strange. The road didn't show up on my GPS. In fact, the little blue dot that marked my car froze in place, like the signal had been cut off. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just bad reception in the mountains. But then I started to notice how quiet it was. Normally, in the Appalachians, you hear birds, crickets, even the distant rush of streams. Here, it was silent. Not even the sound of my tires crunching on gravel felt right. It was muffled, like the trees were swallowing it. About a mile in, I passed an old metal mailbox leaning sideways. It had no numbers, no name, and the post it sat on was rotted through. What unsettled me was that there was no driveway, no sign of a house, just the mailbox, standing there alone, surrounded by woods. I thought about turning around then, but the road seemed too narrow, so I kept driving. The trees grew denser, leaning over the road in ways that made me feel like they were watching me. By the time the cabin came into view, I already felt like I had crossed into a place I wasn't supposed to find. The cabin stood in a clearing, but not the kind you'd expect. There wasn't a driveway, not even the remains of one. No worn trail from the road. It was just there, planted in the middle of a circle of dead grass. It was a single-story log cabin, its wood darkened with age, but intact. The windows were grimy, but the panes weren't broken. The roof sagged, but hadn't collapsed. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, yet somehow untouched by rot or vandalism. I killed the engine and stepped out of the car. The air was colder here, damp in a way that made the back of my neck prickle. I don't know why I walked toward the cabin, but my legs moved on their own. When I reached the porch, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Before I could knock, the hinge groaned and the door eased open by itself, as if the house was inviting me in. Inside, it smelled faintly of smoke, though the fireplace was cold and gray with ash. A set of dishes sat on the table, plates with faded flower designs, one still holding the shriveled remains of something that might have once been meat. A chair was pushed back like someone had just stood up from the table. I ran my hand across the counter, and dust clung to my fingers. But what unsettled me was how frozen in time everything felt. There were shoes by the door, a coat draped over the arm of the couch, and a cracked photo frame on the mantel. It looked as if whoever lived here had stepped out and never returned. I kept listening, waiting for the creak of floorboards or the sound of someone moving in the back rooms. But the house was silent, except for a soft rustling, like curtains swaying even though the air was still. Every instinct told me to leave, but curiosity rooted me in place. I needed to know why this cabin was here. In the living room, I found a box of photographs on a shelf. Most were black and white, faded, curling at the edges. They showed the cabin, inside and out. But the longer I looked, the more I realized something was wrong. In picture after picture, there were figures standing by the windows, always blurry, always in the background. Tall, thin shapes, their faces indistinct, but their posture unmistakable. They were watching from inside. A cold sweat broke across my back. I set the photographs down and turned toward the nearest window. The curtain hung limp, but I could have sworn it had just been swaying. That was when I heard the faint crunch of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. Gravel shifting under weight. I held my breath and listened. The steps circled the cabin, pausing at intervals, as if whoever or whatever was out there was stopping to peer inside. My heart hammered against my ribs. I bolted for the door. My car sat right where I had left it, but when I reached into my pocket for the keys, they were gone. I tore through my jacket, checked the porch, retraced my steps inside, but they were nowhere. The footsteps came again, heavier this time, closer. They scraped against the porch steps, and the wood creaked under the weight of something standing just outside the door. I backed into the living room, clutching the photo frame like a weapon. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. I couldn't tell if whatever was outside was waiting for me to move, or if it was already inside with me. Darkness fell fast in the clearing. The cabin had no working lights, so I lit a candle I found on the mantel. Its flame flickered weakly, casting long shadows that seemed to twitch and crawl across the walls. That was when the knocking began. At first, it was just one sound, a single knock at the door, then another, each one slow, deliberate, evenly spaced. I pressed my back against the wall, every muscle in my body stiff. The knocking didn't grow faster, but it didn't stop. It became a rhythm, steady and patient, like the house itself had a heartbeat. Then I realized it wasn't coming from the door anymore. A tap echoed from the left window, then the right, then the one across the room. It spread, knocking in sequence, circling the cabin, like hands pressing against the glass, testing it. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My breath came in short gasps, the candle sputtering in my hand. Finally, I forced myself to look. I crept to the window, lifted the edge of the curtain, and peeked out. Pale faces stared back, dozens of them, pressed against the glass, their features blurred but unmistakable. Empty eyes locked onto mine. The knocking grew louder, all around me, until it felt like the house was shaking. I stumbled back, clutching the candle, and realized there was nowhere left to go. I don't remember blowing the flame out. I don't even remember closing my eyes. All I know is that the knocking never stopped. I was 19 the winter I found that cabin. I'd been driving from Morgantown down to my parents' house in Charleston for Christmas break. It was supposed to be a 4-hour drive, but I'd left late, and by the time I reached the mountains, daylight was running out. At a gas station near Sutton, I asked the clerk if there was a quicker way to get back to the interstate. He nodded toward the pines and told me about a road that cut through the backwoods. Said it was old but passable, and it would shave 30 minutes off the trip. It wasn't on my map, but I figured I could handle it. My car wasn't new, but it was reliable enough. So I followed the directions, turned off the main road, and soon I was winding down a dirt path that seemed like it hadn't been graded in decades. The further I drove, the more the trees closed in around me. Pine branches scratched at the roof, and stone walls crumbled along the edges. Rusted farm equipment, plows, wagon wheels, even a tractor missing its tires lay abandoned on the roadside, half swallowed by weeds. That was when my engine began to sputter. The gas gauge still showed a quarter tank, but the car jerked and stalled as if it had run dry. I tried restarting it, but all I got was a grinding whine. Dusk was bleeding fast into night. The road was too narrow to turn around, and I hadn't seen another vehicle since leaving the gas station. I sat there, staring at the shadows stretching across the pines, wondering if I was going to have to spend the night in the car. That was when I saw the cabin. It sat just off the road, nestled against a slope, with a thin ribbon of smoke curling from the chimney. Its single light glowed faintly in the window. Relief washed over me. Someone lived here. I told myself I'd just ask to use their phone, maybe get directions, and I'd be on my way. I locked the car, pulled my coat tight, and started toward it. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. The smoke drifting from the chimney was faint but steady, and a soft orange light glowed behind the curtains. But the woods around the cabin were silent. No dogs barking, no voices, not even the whistle of wind through the trees. I climbed the steps and knocked on the door. Nothing. I waited, knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I leaned closer, trying to listen. That was when the door groaned and swung inward, just a few inches, as if nudged from inside. "Hello?" I called out. My voice cracked from the cold. "Sorry to bother you. My car broke down." Silence. The heat hit me first when I stepped inside. The fire burned low in the stone hearth, filling the room with a warm, smoky scent. The furniture was simple wooden chairs, a braided rug, shelves lined with mason jars. It looked lived in, but wrong somehow. Muddy footprints trailed across the floor, leading from the doorway into the house. They stopped near the fireplace, but there were no prints leading back out. The rocking chair by the fire shifted slightly, squeaking against the floorboards. No one sat in it. I told myself it was just the draft, but the air inside was still. That was when I noticed the hum. It was faint at first, more of a vibration than a sound, like the distant hum of power lines, except there were no lines out here. I pressed my hand to the wall, and it felt like the cabin itself was trembling beneath my palm. I turned toward the door, ready to leave. But when I looked back, I swore the rocking chair had turned slightly toward me. I told myself I'd just wait by the fire until morning, then try to walk back to the gas station. The cold outside was bone deep, and the heat of the cabin was too tempting to leave behind. I pulled a chair closer to the hearth and sat, rubbing my hands. The hum in the walls pulsed faintly in rhythm with the flicker of the flames. That was when the jars began to rattle. Just a faint tremor, glass tapping against glass, then stillness. The rocking chair creaked again, pivoting another inch, as if it wanted a better view of me. On the mantel, old photographs leaned against the stone. I picked one up. It showed the cabin, the same living room I was standing in. But in the corner of the picture, half hidden by shadow, was a tall figure. I flipped through more of them. In every single photo, there it was. Sometimes near the doorway, sometimes by the stairs, sometimes pressed against a window pane. Always blurred, always indistinct, but always there. Watching, my throat tightened. I set the pictures down and forced myself not to look at the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. The fire popped, throwing sparks into the air. For a moment, the flames dimmed, and I saw them 2 points of light in the darkness beyond the hearth. Eyes. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just watched. I stumbled to my feet, heart pounding, and bolted for the door. The knob was cold against my hand, and I twisted hard, shoving my shoulder into the wood. It didn't move. The fire cracked behind me. The hum in the walls swelled until it shook the floorboards under my boots. Then the knocking started. One tap against the window, then another, from the opposite side, then another, from behind me. Soon every window was knocking, steady and humanly precise. I pressed my back against the door, staring into the room as the jars rattled and the photographs slipped to the floor. The rocking chair groaned again, this time turning to face me completely, and then I saw it. A figure stood beside the chair, tall enough that its head nearly grazed the ceiling beams. Its face was a blur, a smear of shadow, but its eyes burned pale in the firelight. The knocking grew frantic, echoing from inside the walls now, as if the whole cabin was alive, pulsing with whatever this thing was. I screamed, threw myself against the door one last time, and it burst open. A rush of cold night air swallowed me whole. I don't remember if I ran, or if something dragged me back. All I know is that the sound of that knocking has followed me ever since. It was supposed to be just a quiet weekend away. 3 of us, all friends from college, had pulled our money to rent a cabin in eastern Kentucky, somewhere near Red River Gorge. We'd been buried in classes and work, and the idea of a remote place with no cell service sounded perfect. The cabin was down in a hollow, tucked between 2 ridges that rose so steeply, it felt like they were leaning over us. The driveway wound half a mile off the main road before dead-ending at the cabin. No other houses, no power lines, just trees and silence. When we first arrived, it didn't seem sinister. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a tin roof, a wide porch, and a fire pit out front. Inside, it was the usual wood-paneled walls, mismatched furniture, a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. We unpacked, cooked a big meal, and poured drinks. For a while, it felt exactly like what we came for, simple, quiet, and peaceful. But the longer we stayed, the more little things started to gnaw at me. For one, the slope behind the cabin was unnaturally steep. It shot straight up, covered in trees, and I swear the ridgeline seemed closer every time I glanced out the back window. Another thing, there were 4 windows on the back wall, but when I walked inside, only 3 matched up to actual rooms. The 4th should have looked into the bathroom, but it didn't. From the inside, There was no window there at all. I tried to joke about it, but none of us laughed. By midnight, when the fire pit burned low, I realized the woods had gone completely silent. No crickets, no owls, no distant sounds of water, just emptiness pressing in on all sides. I remember lying in bed that first night, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was just how remote cabins feel. But deep down, I knew something about that place was wrong. The second night was when things shifted. We'd spent most of the day hiking, and by evening, we were too tired to do much more than sit around the fire with beers. The air had a damp chill to it, and when we finally went inside, the quiet felt heavier than before. I was brushing my teeth when I heard a faint scratching behind the wall. At first, I figured it was mice, maybe squirrels nesting, but the sound kept coming, steady, deliberate, moving slowly along the length of the cabin. "Do you guys hear that?" I called. Both of them paused. A low thump echoed, followed by what sounded like dragging, like something heavy scraping across wood. We all exchanged nervous glances. One of my friends muttered that it was just the cabin settling, but we knew settling wood doesn't drag. Later, lying in bed, the sound returned, soft steps moving across the floor, then stopping. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps didn't start again, but I could feel the weight of silence pressing against my ears. When I rolled over, my gaze fell on the back wall. Through the curtain, I could see the outline of that window, the one that wasn't supposed to exist from inside. The other windows glowed faintly with moonlight, but that one was pitch black. It wasn't the darkness of night either. It looked thicker, denser, as if the glass wasn't showing the outside at all, but opening into something else. I pulled the blanket tighter and shut my eyes. But I couldn't stop imagining what might be standing on the other side of that glass, waiting. By the third night, none of us were sleeping well. Every time the floor creaked or the wind shifted, we were wide awake, listening. We argued about leaving, but our car refused to start. The battery was fine, the tank half full, yet it just clicked uselessly when we turned the key. Hiking out wasn't much of an option either. The road back was miles long, and nightfall came fast in the hollow. That evening, the noises started earlier. Scraping at the door, soft footsteps circling the cabin. At one point, something rattled the latch hard enough to make us all jump. We barricaded the doors with furniture, though none of us said why out loud. Then we sat in the living room, trying to pretend we weren't waiting for something. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked to the back wall, to that window. My hands shook as I pulled the curtain aside just an inch. He was there. A man stood in the clearing, facing the window directly. He was tall, too tall, his head nearly brushing the slope of the ridge. His skin was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, and his clothes hung loose, shapeless, like they weren't his. His face was blurred, indistinct, but I could feel his eyes drilling into me. I yanked the curtain shut and staggered back. My friends demanded to know what I'd seen, but when I told them, they shook their heads. "You're seeing things," one of them whispered. "Nobody's out here. You're just tired." But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The man was real. He was waiting, and he wasn't leaving. I don't know what time it was when the knocking began. At first, just one tap, then another, spaced out across the walls, then more, faster, louder, until every window in the cabin shuddered with the rhythm. The hum returned, deep and guttural, rising from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. The jars on the shelves rattled. The floorboards quaked under our feet. I looked toward the back wall. The fourth window, the one that didn't belong, was glowing faintly now, pale and cold, casting thin light into the cabin. "Run," I whispered. "We have to run." One friend bolted for the door and wrenched it open, but beyond it wasn't night, it was void. A blackness so complete it looked solid, as if the world itself had been swallowed. The knocking grew frantic, 100 hands slamming in unison. The hum became a roar, and then, through the glow of that impossible window, I saw him again. The man pressed his face against the glass. This time, his features were sharp, pale skin stretched tight, teeth too wide, eyes like pits of endless dark, and he smiled. The knocking stopped. The cabin fell silent. That was the last thing I remember. When Luke first showed me the listing, I thought it was too good to be true. A cabin in the Appalachian mountains, buried in a hollow, ringed by birch trees, with no neighbors for miles. It had that rustic look: old wooden porch, stone chimney, narrow gravel drive curling into the woods. The price was ridiculously low, but we figured it was just because it was off the beaten path. I drove us down narrow back roads that twisted deeper into the hills. By the time we reached the hollow, there was no cell service, no sound of passing cars, not even birdsong. Just the crunch of my tires on gravel and the faint creak of the trees above. The cabin looked almost identical to the photos, but older somehow, like time had been cruel to it since the listing was posted. Paint peeled off the siding, the porch sagged slightly, and one of the shutters hung loose. Still, it had charm. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood smoke, but underneath that was a sour, damp odor. The floors were uneven, the furniture mismatched, and the wallpaper peeled in places. But we didn't care. We had the mountains to ourselves, no one around for miles, and a weekend away from everything. The first night felt almost too quiet. When I woke up at a.m., I realized I couldn't hear anything at all. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just silence so deep I could hear my own pulse. I told myself it was just the isolation. I had no idea then what was waiting beneath Birch Hollow. The next morning, Luke decided to explore while I made coffee. He called me into the living room, pulling back a threadbare rug to reveal a trapdoor in the floor. The latch was rusty, but gave way with the hard tug. A draft of cold, damp air rushed up. Beneath was a crawl space, low and dark. We grabbed our flashlights and peeked inside. The dirt floor was uneven, with old wooden beams propping up the cabin. But on the far side, past a tangle of roots, there was something else: a narrow tunnel, dug into the earth, sloping downward. Luke grinned, but I felt sick looking at it. Something about the way the dirt walls looked clawed out by hand unsettled me. We didn't go down. We just shut the trapdoor and agreed to ignore it. But that night, when I tried to sleep, I heard something. At first, it was faint, like a draft sighing through the floorboards. Then it became clearer. Whispering, I froze in bed, listening. The voices were soft, muffled, like they were right beneath us. I couldn't make out the words, only the tone. Urgent, pleading. Luke claimed he heard nothing when I shook him awake. He laughed, called me paranoid, and went back to sleep. But as I lay there, heart pounding, the whispers grew louder, swelling into what sounded like weeping. And then, just as suddenly, silence returned. The woods in the daylight were strange. I walked the trails around the cabin, expecting to find deer, birds, or at least some sign of life. But there was nothing. The forest was barren of sound, as though everything had fled. That evening, it brought up the crawl space again. We should check out that tunnel, he said. Maybe it leads to an old mine. I wanted nothing to do with it. Just the thought of crawling down there made my skin crawl. I told him no, that we should leave early. But he shrugged it off. That night, the noises began again. But they weren't whispers anymore. They were screams. The sound erupted beneath the floorboards, muffled but powerful, like dozens of voices trapped below. I sat up in bed, trembling, as the wood seemed to tremble with their cries. Luke finally admitted he heard it too, his face pale in the glow of the lantern. The stench of damp soil filled the cabin, thick and choking, as though the earth itself was exhaling through the floor. Then, outside the window, the birch trees moved. Not in the wind, because there was none, but in a slow, unnatural sway, bending toward the cabin. The hollow was alive, and it was breathing with us. Luke went first, crawling through the narrow passage with his flashlight. I followed reluctantly, the dirt brushing my face, the air damp and heavy. The deeper we went, the louder the sounds became. Screams, sobs, voices overlapping in an endless chorus of pain. The tunnel opened into a pit. My light swept over it, and my stomach dropped. The floor was covered in bones. Human bones. Dozens, maybe hundreds, tangled together in the earth. The walls bore deep gouges, like fingernails raking through the soil, desperate to escape. Then the voices stopped. The silence was absolute. I turned to Luke, ready to whisper that we needed to get out, but his flashlight beam shook wildly. Something was behind us, The tunnel was no longer empty. We had thought the voices were cries of the damned, but in that final silence, I understood. They hadn't been cries. They had been warnings, and now, whatever lived beneath Birch Hollow was no longer trapped.